And welcome back to Cibolo Creek Conversations. My name is Wyatt Marchant. I'm here with my good friend, Mr. Paul Wilson. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Good.
Beautiful day here in Texas.
It is. It's at 80 degrees in February.
Yeah.
So
Nobody's complaining about that.
I actually don't like it. I'd rather it be cold.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Why is that?
Don't know. Just like it better. It's too hot. I don't like the hot.
Yeah. I grew up in cold, lived in Pennsylvania, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I don't know. I've been gone from it for so long now. When it gets these cold snaps, I'm sort of like, ugh, let's get through this. Maybe it's just my age, but I was telling my wife I was out walking the dog one night and it was really, really cold. I was like, man, this used to never bother me. Now it feels like the wind's just blowing right through
You
me.
can feel it in your hip.
My hips bother me.
It's going to rain tomorrow.
Exactly. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm talking like old people.
But well, good. Well, hey, today we're going to talk about something that we kind of touched on last episode, but I figured we could dive a little bit deeper.
Okay.
It's really just how to share your faith, kind of the what and the why and the how of sharing your faith. And I know you're teaching a class on this right now, actually, at Cibolo Creek.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I want to discuss today.
Okay. Yeah. Just a little bit of context for our listeners. So I'm doing a series of messages right now at the church. We're in week 5 of what will be a 6-week discussion. And it's really about trying to help our church family understand kind of the nature of what the church's role in the world is and the nature of what a Christian's responsibilities are when it comes to helping introduce people to Christ. So we've been talking about that on Sundays. And then 2 weeks ago, I started teaching a class through our Cibolo U, which is our kind of our educational arm. And that title of that class is How to Share Your Faith. So this kind of stuff's all kind of front burner for me right now, thinking through really a lifetime of exposure to the topic and things that are important to me that I feel like sometimes talking about the topic of evangelism or sharing our faith doesn't get covered in ways that I think it should. And so just thinking a lot about those kinds of things right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And if it does get covered, it's oftentimes people have this perception of like this street evangelizer.
Yeah,
Or,
exactly. Standing on a soapbox down in the Alamo Plaza, screaming and yelling at people. And that is a very common perception to this day. And so many Christians, they go, that's not me, and I'd never do that. So then they just don't do anything that's really what we would describe as evangelism.
Yeah.
Sharing their faith with their friends.
I was recently in New Orleans and I was on Bourbon Street, and sure enough, there was people there handing out pamphlets, having conversations with people.
Yeah.
I don't know how effective that is, but
I'm never one to say it can't be, useful, but I think in our current culture, I don't know if it's the most effective method.
yeah.
Again, God can do anything and uses people in that way. I don't think I've ever been downtown San Antonio there around Alamo Plaza that I haven't seen the same. And
Or the Riverwalk, I've seen it there too.
yeah.
Yeah.
Some guy standing there, usually on some stair or some, low wall. And then he's got some, cheap boom box that he's being amplified through. And it really, for the most part, always sounds like yelling and screaming.
Mm-hmm.
And so me as a Christian, me as a pastor, I sort of, sit out on the sidelines and watch it for a few minutes.
That's what I
just
did.
out of curiosity. One, to hear what they're saying, of course, but more importantly, just to watch the crowd's response. And, most people are walking right by.
Yeah.
They're not engaging in the conversation. And again, not going to say that God can't and hasn't used those situations, but probably not the most effective approach.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just get into the why, or even the reason that Christians, the church, is supposed to, as you put it in our series, build these bridges, people who are lost, to try to share the gospel with people with unbelievers.
Yeah. Um, I, where do you even begin? Where I was beginning with my class, I was helping them understand that when most people think about being a Christian, or they think about, the church, most Christians, that's really sort of understood from a very internally focused perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And they really experience their life as a Christian by what's in it for me. I believed in Jesus, and he forgave my sin, and I was adopted as one of his sons and daughters, and I became a part of the family of God, and now the Holy Spirit lives inside of me to guide me, and 5 or 6 other things, and I get to go to heaven when I die. And please, you and I both understand those are awesome things.
Mm-hmm.
But for many Christians, that's just the end in and of itself. Is it, how does Jesus benefit me?
Yeah. They
How
did
does,
almost like a subscription model.
and it's what's in it for me sort of spirit, really. And then the same for church. Most people, when they think about church, it's very internally focused. It's where I worship, and it's my friend group. And for some Christians, that's the only friends that they have are, other Christians. And it's where I get to do my things, the worship and the prayers and the Bible studies and all the things. And it becomes an end in and of itself. And what I'm wanting our church to understand, and this is what I'm covering on Sunday mornings in the picture of the bridge, and what I'm introducing the class to, is that when we really understand Christian and when we really understand church, it has a very outward focus to it. It has a very outward purpose to it. So, yes, I've been saved, amazing grace, outrageous mercy toward me that God would provide me salvation. But that was never intended to be the end. I was saved for a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
The church was established for a purpose. And my take, other people might disagree, but I think that larger purpose for our salvation and for, our existence as the community of faith called the church, I think it was that we were to be ambassadors of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world in which we live.
Mm-hmm.
So the why is really about understanding, I think, the larger purpose of salvation and our calling as Christians. And in fact, last week in my class, we did a bunch of review, and I kind of laid some more groundwork. And then I asked them the question, do you know what incarnation is? A couple of them had a kind of a sketchy idea of what incarnation was. They weren't completely sure. So we talked about incarnation, and I said, why would that have anything to do with our topic? And what I was explaining was, I think the incarnation is a demonstration of the important purpose of our lives, is that we then live in a world to build relationships with people with the hope of introducing them to the gospel. Like God came from heaven to live among us, to live life with us so that he could share the message of, grace and hope and salvation. Then that's an example for us of, we are to live incarnational kind of lives where we live with friends, neighbors, coworkers, classmates, with the hope of seeking and saving the lost, like we see in the life of Jesus. And in fact, I was explaining to them, I think that one of the most important skills to sharing your faith is being able to nurture and build relationships well. You could be a master at, the script of telling people, this is the gospel. But if you can't respect and you can't develop healthy relationships with somebody, then it doesn't matter how good you are at explaining it, it just isn't received.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's important to me for people to understand the gospel is a relational story, and faith is a relational story. It's about coming to trust another person. And in my mind, evangelism, this idea of sharing our faith, it's a relational pursuit. It's building relationships with people with the hopes of the opportunity to tell them about our Savior who, has offered salvation to them too.
Yeah.
And that's then the picture of the bridge that we're using in the Sunday morning series, is that we build relationships with the hopes of entering into a conversation and encounters and conversations about the difference that Christ has made in our lives, with the hope of being able to introduce our friends to Christ.
Yeah. And I think that kind of touches on, because I think a lot of Christians might just not see it as their job. Like, well, I'm not gifted in the spiritual gift of evangelism or whatever. And so they might just not see it as their job, whereas they will abdicate it onto, church leaders or
let the preacher do it,
or other people who are just really passionate about it. But that relational piece can only be done if the entire body of Christ has that same mindset, because you can't have a relationship with 300 people. It's just not you could know them, you know their names. Sunday morning you get tested, I'm sure, every single Sunday as people walk in.
Exactly.
But you can't really have a relationship with them.
No.
Whereas if each person, regardless of their spiritual giftings, understands that role, they can actually have relationships with the people at their work, people that they know from daycare, school, whatever.
Right. So I can't know all of the people in the church, and I certainly can't know all their friends.
Yeah.
So if it's only left to me as the preacher to lead their friends to Christ, it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
Now we can work as a team,
mm-hmm.
right? If they're out nurturing and developing the relationships, if they have, some basic skills on how to direct conversations or, have conversations about faith, then God's using them to build bridges. And perhaps through an invitation to our church, some of the gifts that I have might be helpful to that person who's, kicking the tires and looking under the hood about it all. But I can't be responsible for leading an entire community to Christ. But imagine a church that felt like each Christian was mobilized to build those bridges. A lot of great things could happen.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one of the, say, barriers that might be in the way between someone and sharing their faith, is just not thinking it's one of their responsibilities. What are some of the other common things that you've heard come up over the years?
About what?
About why someone that would stop someone from sharing their faith or keep them from doing it.
Yeah, so I recognize there's three of them, three of the big ones. The first one is ignorance, which we just talked about. Some people just don't know that that's a part of what it means to be a follower of Christ, is that I become an ambassador and a witness and a voice on behalf of the message of the gospel. So some people just don't know it, so they're not going to do it. The other one is fear. They're just afraid of getting started in the conversation or initiating the conversation. And really, when you dig down inside of that fear is a lot about image. I don't want to appear stupid. I don't want to appear holier than thou. I don't want to appear judgmental. I don't want to appear like I don't understand my faith enough to explain it to somebody. So most people will just avoid, skirt the conversation when, those doors seem to be open to have some sort of a conversation. They just won't, because they're afraid. I don't know what to say. I don't know enough about my Bible. I don't know how to answer whatever objections or questions they might have. So I'm afraid to get started. And then the last one, I think, is the most concerning one, and that is people just don't care.
Yeah.
They just don't care about their friends, their neighbor, their coworker, their spouse, their kids enough to push through that fear and the awkwardness that can come from a conversation about faith. They just don't care. I, and and here's the hard truth of that is we're basically saying, "Oh man, I'm excited. I get to go to heaven when I die, but sorry about your luck."
Yeah.
So they just don't care enough to look at what the eternal equation is and recognize that without Christ, these people that I know and love will spend eternity separated from God in hell. I don't care.
Yeah.
So, the ignorance factor, the fear factor, and then the lack of the apathy factor, the lack of compassion enough to make the effort or to even learn a few skills that might help facilitate getting to share your faith with someone.
Yeah. I think it's a really good thing for people to consider. Like, if you're listening to this, think about, like, do you have an aching in your heart for the people in your lives that don't know Christ?
Right.
I think it's important self-assessment to do to kind of see where you're at. And that could also just come from, like, not knowing, not understanding.
Yeah.
But an example in my own life, like where I had it, but I also messed up. I had a friend who he was an atheist, and he got into a really bad car accident, and he was fine. And so in my head, I was like, oh man, because like my heart would break for him that he was an atheist, and he survives this car accident where he should have been hurt, somehow, or dead. But then I used that time right afterwards to, like, he felt like I was trying to sell him something after a horrible tragedy.
Right.
This is early high school.
Yeah.
But I had the compassion, I had the aching, but I did the wrong thing by doing it too soon.
Too soon, too fast.
Too soon, too fast. But yeah, I think that's really important to consider.
Yeah, and that goes back to a little bit of that, relational IQ to know where am I in the relationship to bring this topic up, or is this the right time and the right place to have this discussion? And again, I was telling my class, don't underestimate the value of going to lunch or going to see a movie or going to a concert or hanging out playing golf or pickleball. The relational investment builds rapport and trust to when later on there's an opportunity, something like an accident happens. Now the conversation seems to have more credence.
Yeah.
Because I've made the relational investment.
Yeah. Okay, so how do we kind of overcome those barriers? I think we kind of discussed the first one of just not knowing the responsibility that, well, we do. So, learning that we do. But then the fear, the image thing, how does like one overcome that? Because I'm guessing there's a lot of people listening, not a lot of people listening, those who are listening,
Exactly.
where that has been an issue, where they're worried about looking stupid or not knowing how to answer something, or maybe somebody, they're afraid that they're going to come at them with like a doctorate level, assessment of evolution and try to disprove everything they're saying.
Yeah, and that's a great question. But it's like anything in life. The more you understand something and the more often you do it, the more comfortable you get at it. Like I could take a person who's deathly afraid of roller coasters, and we're doing an experiment. Deathly afraid of roller coasters. I get them on a roller coaster, and they go on that roller coaster 1,000 times. There's going to be some point in that they're like, okay, this isn't as scary as I thought.
Yeah.
It's just, why? Because they got familiar with it.
Exposure therapy.
Yeah, they know what that feels like now. So the same with the person who doesn't feel comfortable sharing their faith. The more you learn about it, develop a few skills around doing it, understand what you're trying to do, and then basically practicing, looking for ways to have conversations with your friends, coupled with a genuine compassion for them, can go a long way to learning how to do it. at the end of the day, yeah, I think I can say this. At the end of the day, there's really only maybe 6, 8 common objections or questions that come up in the discussion of, you know, why a person's resistant to the gospel. So learn more about those 8 topics.
Yeah.
Be prepared to sort of tackle that as it comes up. Don't be intimidated by it because you've gotten smarter about how to do it. The other thing that I coach people with is quit taking the posture or assuming the role of the answer man. I take a completely different approach. I'm just the biggest question asker there is.
Yeah.
So I just ask questions. Tell me more about why you think that. Tell me more about where you came up with that. Tell me more about why you believe that. And just rather than feeling like you're on the spot to come up with answers all the time, you can really just guide the conversation by keeping questions flowing.
Yeah.
And I think this was our last podcast. I was sharing with you about a friend that I had a great conversation with, and so the tact I took is he was asking me questions. I'd ask him questions for more understanding of where he was coming from, and then seriously, and I wasn't doing this inauthentically. I would go, oh, that's really interesting because you believe this, and I, as a Christian, I believe this, and then there was just this natural opening
Yeah.
because we had been talking about what he believed. He was curious about where I came from, so I'd share what I believe. And we really covered the gambit of his objections
Yeah.
and concerns. Again, he didn't accept Christ there at that restaurant that day, but I shared my faith.
Yeah.
But I wasn't in the position of, the answer man who had to come in and provide a defense for all of the objections he was throwing at my way. And I'm completely comfortable saying to somebody, "Oh man, that's a really good question. I don't yeah, I don't get that either."
Yeah.
Or, that's something to think about. Let me get back to you. Maybe I can explain it with a little bit more, longer time to think about it. But yeah, I think most people feel like they're on the spot to have all the right answers.
Yeah.
And I think that ends up creating fear. That fear is enough to talk you out of getting into the conversation.
Yeah. And I found too that whenever you do that question and answer thing where you're asking a lot of questions and they ask you questions back, I end up running into a lot of just incorrect understandings of what Christians actually think, or at least what the Bible says.
Yeah.
Of just, they've heard this, or they think that Christians think this. And so that gives me an opportunity to be like, no, that's also, I also think that's crazy. You can
Yeah.
believe in God and Christ and think that that's also insane or incorrect or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. I've been in that same experience, and you'll hear people say, "Well, I'm not very religious," and I'll say, "Oh, me neither."
Mhm.
And they're like, you can kind of catch them. They're like, "What? No, not much for religion either." Oh, I have this little, but I'm really interested in a relationship with God, and it's very different than a religion. Okay, so just that little tack
Yeah.
can lead to a conversation. Um, I'm not much for church, and then I say, "Yeah, me neither." And they're like, "But you're a pastor,"
Mhm.
and I'll go, "Yeah, but what you're talking about is this kind of formal, traditional, boring experience." I go, "Yeah, I'm not for that either."
Yeah.
I think God had something very different in mind when He imagined the church.
Yeah. Okay. So how does one overcome just the apathy towards it?
It's a great question. And it's actually the one I'm wrestling with on how to teach to it for the part 6 of the message series I'm in. Um, there's probably a couple of different answers to that. How does one overcome the apathy? One, I think it begins with really understanding the nature of what happened with your own salvation. Like I got saved from hell. I got saved from an eternal punishment for my sin. Um, so really appreciating the nature of our own salvation, I think, can go a long way to pushing us beyond our apathy. Um, I don't mean this as a scare tactic, but imagining people that you know and love slipping into eternity without knowing Christ and then realizing that they'll spend eternity in hell apart from God. Um, Again, I don't, my intent here is not scare tactic, but recognizing that someday I'm going to stand before the living God and give an account of my life. And I think we're going to be really surprised what kind of, questions he's going to ask for accountability. And I don't have a hard time imagining he's like, I placed you that in that house on that street. You lived there for 21 years. And you never once bothered to invite those people to church or, you know, do anything to share what you found to be so true about the gospel, about Christ's work in your life. I That's going to be a really uncomfortable conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, you invited them over for football every Sunday, but
Yeah,
you
yeah.
don't think
I was
anymore.
telling my class, and I think I can tell this story without getting in trouble. When I was in graduate school, I lived with a family that rented a room to me, and they had lived on that street for like 14 years. And I remember them telling me that they didn't know either of the neighbors that lived on either side of them. Now, here's how they explain that is in Dallas, a lot of the subdivisions or neighborhoods, um, houses face out toward the street, but the garages are in the back, and there's an alley between both sides of the street. So people they drive down their alley, they pull in their garage, they go into their house. So there just isn't a whole lot that goes on out
You
front.
never see them, really.
Never see them other than maybe out mowing the grass. And typically you're not stopping to mow the grass to. So I just remember thinking, you've lived here for like 14 years and you still don't even know your neighbors. So, where were we going with that?
The apathy side, how to get over the apathy. That's where we were at. And then talking about imagining
Oh, standing,
hell and standing before
standing
God.
before God someday and giving an account of our lives. So, yeah, I don't, I wish I had a really good answer for how I shake people out of an apathy, um, and create a compassion. Certainly, there's one side of the equation that said, well, you just need to know Jesus more and really understand his heart because you can't really understand the heart of Jesus unless you understand a heart for lost people because it was the entire reason he came to this earth. But um, yeah, if I had a better answer, I'd probably be a little bit better at motivating people to step outside of their apathy.
I think it has to just, I mean, ultimately it comes down to the reality of hell as a place to begin with.
Yeah,
Because, like, if you have, say, you take the annihilationist standpoint where you think that those who don't know Christ just essentially cease to exist afterwards, well, then, like, that's not great, but at least it's not eternal conscious torment
right.
apart from God,
Yeah,
you know? But, so, like, if I would say if you don't think that a loving God could allow someone to uh, separate themselves from him forever, which is what hell would be, then you just need to really make sure that you're sure about that before you, because like if
yeah,
you're wrong,
yeah. But here's the interesting thing, though: if you use that particular point as a way to jettison people out of apathy, it feels very heavy-handed,
yeah,
right? But it has a place. I mean, it has significance to the discussion. I think another thing that I might say, rather than just, well, your friend's going to go to hell if you don't stand in their way and help. Um, I think another missing part is that we often think about salvation in terms of like afterlife.
Hmm.
But what about salvation now and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
enormous difference it makes in our life? And do Christians have the kind of faith experience and the kind of relationship with God now that they see the enormous value and benefits of being a follower of Jesus Christ? That they could say to somebody, this isn't just about heaven and hell. This is about knowing a relationship with God that brings joy, that brings peace, that brings hope, that makes a difference with how I parent and how I experience marriage. Living those sorts of lives that allow the gospel to change us in who we are now, I think can also be a very, very important way of helping people understand how they might describe the gospel to another person.
Yeah, yeah. No, I would never suggest telling someone, "Hey, if you don't, then your friend's gonna go to hell." But I would just say, like, all I was saying was just an appropriate understanding of
Yeah, what's at stake?
what's at stake.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's just having a theology of hell, really, you
Right,
know. And
right.
so, because if you have that, then it's really hard to excuse yourself. Um,
Exactly.
so, but if you also have an accurate, theology of Christ, then it's really hard to excuse yourself. So, um, okay, so let's maybe move into just some like practical ways of what sharing your faith can look like. So we started off with a description of those folks who yell on street corners or
Right.
whatever. So what does that look like for the normal person who isn't going to go do that?
The normal person. Um, yeah, so I don't have a graph or an image I can put up for anybody, but if we imagined like at the center is a circle and it's the gospel. It is the truths about Jesus dying for sin, extending grace and mercy and forgiveness. If that's at the center, that's that's part of sharing our faith. That's the most important part is sharing the message of Jesus. But there's then all these other circles outside of that one, attending circles. And so let's put in one of those circles your conversion story or like your spiritual journey, how you came to Christ and the difference he's made in your life. Whenever you tell that story, you're sharing your faith.
Hmm.
Another circle could be invitation to your church. You can share your faith by inviting a neighbor, a friend, hey, come with me to church. And that doesn't even have to be Sunday morning. That could be something hosted by your church. Hey, you've got kids my age. We're in a wonderful church. It has great children's ministry. They're doing this thing this Saturday. It's a lot of fun for kids. Why don't you join us for that? That's sharing your faith. Um, Caring for somebody or serving somebody. You got a neighbor, they need a ride to the hospital. You offer and you take them, a ride to the hospital or to a doctor's appointment. Um, that's sharing your faith. That's sharing love, compassion, concern for your neighbor. You read a really good book about faith, about spiritual journey. When you pass that book on to them and say, hey, we've been talking a little bit about like what you believe and I believe. I read this book. I thought that was really interesting and maybe that'd be helpful to you. That's sharing your faith. So if at the center is the gospel, and then there's all these other expressions of relationship and concern and compassion for other people in your life, those are all expressions of sharing your faith that we hope with prayer and persistence can become bridges to the opportunity to tell them about the story that's in the middle of, of all of those other circles.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, sharing your faith isn't about standing on a street corner and screaming the gospel at passerbys. Um, sharing your faith is about, hey, there's a guy from work. I'd like to get to know him, take him out. You start going out to lunch once or twice every other month, starting to get to know, hey, well, let's go play some golf with, then, hey, what do you say our wives, four of us get together and we go out for dinner, and you're building a relationship. And I think that's all part of a very practical approach to sharing your faith. And then as the relationship blossoms, and now there's trust and there's rapport and there's like shared experience, then when the door opens, like, let's say this couple that you've been developing this relationship with, his one of his parents passes away. Well, now you can move toward that and say, hey, I know that's really hard. I lost my dad a few years ago. Can I pray for you? You're sharing your faith. And then weeks later, hey, I've been praying for you. I know that's got to be a hard loss. What do you think? What do you think about like life after death? You ever thought about that? So those are all real practical ways that you just start zeroing in. And I don't mean that like in a project fashion, but a certain intentionality. Like, I really would like to see this guy come to Christ. I think Christ could make an enormous difference in his life. So developing the relationship and looking for and seizing those opportunities of conversation about the truth of Jesus, I think is, in my opinion, the most beautiful expression of sharing our faith, because it's normal, it's natural, it's loving, it's sincere, it's authentic, it's not judgmental. And that's what you don't get with the street preacher.
Yeah.
It's, he may be very impassioned by it, but in the face of strangers, that's not how it's received.
Yeah. Yeah. It can, you made a mention, like, it's not like a project, because it can sound like one swooping in after a hardship or a tragedy to try to, like
Ambulance
what I
chasing.
said. Yeah. Ambulance chasing, like what I said about my friend.
Yeah.
But it reminded me, I was like, man, that does sound like that. But it reminded me of a quote by C.S. Lewis that I share all the time. But essentially, C.S. Lewis said that pain is a megaphone that God uses to rouse a deaf world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, well, that makes sense, because even if you were to hear the gospel, before you accept Christ, you're inflicted with this conviction. That's pain. But that's what roused you out of that, that contentness.
Contentment.
Contentness. I don't like any of this.
Contentment is a word.
Contentment. Well, anyways, but it can rouse you out of that to then examine those different areas that you maybe before were able to ignore.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly don't want to portray that it's only after some, tragic event that the doors open. I mean, I might have a bit of an advantage because I'm a pastor, so there's these assumptions about, me. But yeah, it's not uncommon for me to be having lunch with somebody, and if I don't, if I know that they're not a follower of Christ, tell me, did your family go to church when you were a kid? Did you grow up in the church? Or grow up around? What did your family do with all that?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we never went to church. Or, oh, we went to Christmas and Easter. That was it. Or, oh, we were good Catholics, meaning we never went to the Catholic Church, but we were Catholic. So just that simple question, it doesn't have to do anything with some sort of life event.
Yeah.
It's just the curiosity of trying to get to know somebody.
Yeah, and whenever it comes to like sharing your own story, like, I don't know, an easy way to describe that is, what was your life like before? And then whenever you accepted Christ, then what was your life like afterwards? And that's not to say that, Christ, that following Christ is just a self-help type scenario.
Right.
It's just, because a lot of the times, your life didn't from the outside actually visibly change that much, but your experience in it did. So yeah, just being able to tell someone what life was like before, what caused you to, consider Christ, and what life was like afterwards, is a really simple way of understanding that. And if you need to like write it out just simply before you say it, then
Yeah, one outline that I've seen that's helpful for people is um, their story, your story, God's story.
Yeah.
So the whether it's a conversation at a table or whether it's like months in the making, getting to know their story. What is their spiritual interest? What are their religious backgrounds? What do they make of all that stuff? Getting familiar with their story. Then whether you're asking permission or the opportunity is taken, let me tell you my story. This was me. This was how I came to understand the difference that Christ makes in a life. And this is me afterwards. So I took time to hear their story, respect their story, value their story. Out of that rapport,
Yeah.
I can then share my story. Here's a little bit of what my experience has been. And then again, this may be the same conversation. This may be 4 months later. Can I tell you about the story that I think God's trying to communicate to all of us? That's that story at the center, the gospel story, the story about Jesus and
Yeah.
his gift of salvation. So, um, yeah, it's people aren't a project. And the other thing I teach our classes is that evangelism is a process. It takes months, maybe even years, for God to be at work in a lot of different ways in a person's life for them, come to truly understand it. Um, my experience, again, it's limited in the sense of I'm not the guy that gets on airplanes and leads the entire, you know, coach section into faith before we land. It's not that guy. Um, my experience is that it usually takes a long time
Yeah.
to develop the relationship, to win the rapport, to be able to have those conversations. And if you can relax in the fact that it's not mine to accomplish, it's just mine to bear witness of, and I can trust that God might be using me at this part of that person's process,
Yeah.
but it's using somebody else too. Or God knows there's going to be this experience or event in their life that's really going to kind of open them up to hearing in a way they've never heard before. And again, it might be years in the making. It's a process, and because I'm not responsible for the process, I'm just responsible for my part in the process. Um, I don't feel that panic like, oh, I can't leave the table unless they've accepted Christ here today. I don't feel that
Yeah.
sort of pressure.
Yeah. And this is almost where it gets into the hard part of like the free will. We don't have to dive into this that much, but I was going to make that point of like, it really it isn't ours to accomplish, like you said. Like if it is so that that person is going to be saved and God's going to call that person to himself, which that happens regardless of what you think about all of that. Like the Holy Spirit has to call you. Like you can't save yourself.
Right.
And so if it's God's will that person will be saved, that person will be saved, even if I'm, too stupid or lazy or whatever you want to say to actually engage my responsibility. I'll just have to answer for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, your theology ends up informing kind of your understanding of evangelism. So yeah, God ignites faith in the human soul. I don't.
Yeah.
All I'm trying to do is be some sort of an instrument or a vessel through which the appeal that God is making is communicated consistently, both in my life and in my words, that might facilitate that person eventually putting it all together in God's timing and come to know Christ.
Alexa going rogue.
What did we say that set her off?
No idea. Sometimes she just starts talking. Another thing I was going to say is, and I bring this up probably too much, but Christ told his disciples, so already Christians, that the world's going to know that you're my disciples because of your love for one another. So he told Christians The world will know who you belong to because of your love for each other.
Right.
And so what that translates to, at least in part in my life, is, well, I have a great group of Christian friends, and here's where a lot of people kind of go wrong, is that they stop there, or they just stay together, just better than nothing. But you're, again, like we talked about in the beginning, you've stopped short. Then you invite other people into that group, and they get to experience what that life is like. And I think the true Christian life in community with other Christians is so different. It's supposed to be so different that people will want to know what is up with that.
Right.
And so that's a very like practical way of bringing people in. But again, if you don't know any people who aren't Christians or who believe something different,
Yeah.
then you can't even do that. You're not going out of your way to try to figure out, who those people are.
Yeah. We have this really sweet couple at church, fairly new to our church. He's been a committed Christian for a long time. It's been an important part of his life. His wife, she's brand new to it all. And in my conversations with her, she really has that kind of like, I got kind of invited into this world, this relational world through my husband, and I didn't know what I would find.
Yeah.
And what she found was this community of people treating each other with this really profound love and respect and, joy and feeling safe with each other. And so that was the witness of the community, like you're just describing. That was really a profound influence in her life to her decision to pursue a better understanding of who Jesus is and to place her trust in him.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's so important, I think, for the church, not, the building, the community of faith, that, yeah, we're living like Christ followers toward each other, and then having the relationships in our life with people who are not Christians so that they can see what that looks like and feels like, and hopefully see something that's different about those Christian friends that they have versus maybe other friends that they
Yeah.
have.
Man, I was just thinking, I was like, man, and that opportunity in particular is almost so easy to accomplish nowadays, just because of how broken the world is, that even just coming into a home where there's a wife and a husband and they love each other and they love their kids, like that alone is like a shocking thing
Right.
to stumble upon.
Right.
Much less you bring in other friends who care for each other and do those things and have a genuinely good time. And
Yeah.
like the opportunity for that itself to, like you said, the witness of the community is just so strong right now because of just how broken and lost people are
Complicated.
and complicated.
So many lives are. Yeah.
But there's a yearning for it.
Yes.
There's a yearning for it.
Yes. And so in some ways, I think the opportunities are rich for the church to be more engaged and more effective at, sharing Christ with other people. But somehow we got to work through some of the obstacles of, the ignorance and the fear and the apathy.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the times the church has just grown content because, a lot of people have grown up in say the United States, where most people at least profess to be Christians. So they almost didn't even, they weren't surrounded by a need to be active in that way.
Yeah. So I have prepared my message for this coming Sunday, and sort of my conclusion to this week's message is I feel like maybe the church has just grown a bit tired and discouraged about the prospect of leading people to Jesus.
Mm.
And they've maybe just decided it doesn't work. Nobody's interested. The divide's too great, that they have sort of maybe just threw up their hands in a sense of defeat. Like, it wouldn't matter if I shared Christ with those people; they're not going to come to know Christ.
Yeah.
And we take all kind of the social issues of, you know, politics. Everyone's so divided, and lifestyles, and everybody's so divided, and um, I guess I see a bit of that apathy in Christians is like, well, I just don't think anybody's ever gonna believe what I have to tell them,
Yeah.
so I just don't bother.
They'll automatically be seen as hateful or
Yeah,
whatever.
exactly. Yeah,
That makes sense too, especially with, you can blame the internet, social media a lot for that. Cause I mean, the vision that a lot of Christians get, say in a small town like Bernie, of people who are on the completely different side of the spectrum on morals, religion, politics, whatever it is like, somebody up there celebrating abortion. And it's like, well, that's like not most people who disagree with you.
right.
That's just a small fraction of those people, but it's not most of them. And so, a Christian might say, like, "Well, I can't talk to that person. And you might not be able to, but that's not most people.
Right.
So I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, I was in a conversation the other day in one of the meetings of our staff, and somebody was making a case about Christians that have become so polarized with their world
Yeah.
by way of, politics and by way of lifestyles and morality that they would never say it, but the truth is, well, I hate that person because they're a something or other.
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to share my faith with them because I don't care. And I mean, if that could be any more contrary to the heart of Christ, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, Jesus didn't come to this earth and find what he found because we were so likable, because we were so, close to being on the same page with him. Our hearts were rebellious, and we're completely opposed to everything about God's laws in our life. And yet he came and he moved toward us, and he made available this tremendous offer of salvation. And again, we can talk about, some difference between evangelism and discipleship's about, growing mature followers of Christ. Well, if you're discipling people and they do not have the heart of Christ for lost people, then your discipleship's it's missing the point.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I see that a lot. I was sharing, I guess, with the classes. I've been around the church since the third grade. I went to a Bible college, prepared for ministry, so I was immersed in all of that. Go to graduate school, get a master's of theology degree. I was immersed in that. Been a pastor now for 35 years. And the the drumbeat of most churches is discipleship, discipleship, discipleship. And when you look at what they mean by that, when you look at all the curriculums that are out there for discipleship, the books and the workbooks and the conferences, and I'm not being critical, most of that discipleship conversation is about training people to be, devoted followers of Jesus. But if you look at that curriculum, 99% of it, there's little to nothing about equipping that Christ follower to share their faith.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about, teach them how to study their Bible, teach them how to pray, teach them how to, you know, be regular at attending their church and active in their church, and teach them how to serve. It's all this mastery of these important, spiritual growth skills. And again, I'm not critical of that. You very rarely see in most discipleship content how to equip a person to have the heart of Christ for lost people.
Yeah.
And I just think that's really, really unfortunate. I was sharing, I guess it was on a Sunday morning, that I'm starting to just redefine discipleship. Discipleship is nurturing the heart of Christ in another person. And if you're going to do that honestly and accurately, you can't miss the heart of Christ for lost people.
Yeah.
It was everything to him. It's why he came to this earth. It's why he went to the cross. It's what his message was all about, was drawing people to himself so they could be restored to a relationship with his Father. And you just don't see that heartbeat in the church and among many Christians these days. And I just think that's really, really unfortunate.
I think it has a lot to do with a lot of Christians, like you were saying, are just kind of black-pilled. You know what that term means?
I don't, but you're going to explain it to us.
Yeah. So black-pilled is just kind of like, kind of a I give up type of scenario.
Okay.
So you don't have hope for things. And I think a lot of Christians just see things as being just like evil just ran so rampant.
Right.
And you can just see it a lot more now that, like you were saying, it's like, well, I don't like that person. And that person, and I think a lot of Christians might even think, well, that person is like clearly being used by evil forces.
Yeah.
And it's like, that might be true. But at the same time, Christ said, like, well, the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. So it's like there's an offensive attitude there.
Yeah.
Of it's like, yeah, there might be some evil forces going on there. That's just something, but at the same time,
all the more need for Christ
correct,
and intervene in that.
Yeah.
It's very much the story of Jonah.
Yeah.
In the Old Testament is God says, I want you to, go to Nineveh. And he's like, no, they're evil people. I don't want to tell them anything. And well, you're still going.
Yeah.
And there's lots of lessons from the book of Jonah, but one of them is God loves those Ninevites. And I intended you to be a voice on my behalf to them with the message of faith. And so I think we see a lot of that in the polarization of our Christian communities from, our contemporary culture. And we have all these things we judge, point our fingers at and say it's wrong. And it is wrong, but it's created a bit of a hard heart toward the people who are behind that. And it really should ignite within us just a even greater compassion. Like that person is desperately lost.
Yeah.
Unless Christ intervenes in their life will never know the peace and the joy that he has to offer them here, and they certainly won't know it in eternity. But we don't see that happening. We just see the push them away, keep them away kind of spirit. I've often thought that 2 Corinthians chapter 5, was it verses 18 through 20 something? The Apostle Paul says, Christ worked in our life and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. And then he says it again, he gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Then he defines what that ministry is that God was reconciling the world to himself by not counting their sins against them. And then at the end of the passage, he makes this plea, whatever you do, be reconciled to God. And my observation, certainly of many of the churches I grew up in, they didn't see themselves as having the ministry of reconciliation. They had the ministry of condemnation. So they were always, castigating this entire, world that we lived in. That's the bad people, the sinners, the ones opposed to God, and God in heaven going, yeah, exactly. Those are the ones that I placed you on this earth. I granted you a relationship with me through this amazing work called salvation. Now I'd like you to take my heart and move toward them. But unfortunately, many churches just live very ostracized from the very people that need the Jesus that they serve the most.
Yeah. Do you think that could come from an insecurity of the church or the Christians not changing the people, but the people changing the church?
Oh, sure.
I mean, we see a lot. I mean, we see a lot of that of things creeping in, because I know that, like, say whenever you talk about it, talk about, say, some of those more cultural issues, it's not from a place of pointing your finger, but just of a place of, hey, like, this is what the scriptures teach on this, because you recognize a need maybe within the surrounding culture or the church itself of needing to address such a thing. But I think a lot of churches are almost insecure that they're the ones that are going to be corrupted. And so you see, like in the New Testament, a lot of like Paul, I guess what would be called church discipline, of having the church removing those problem people out of the church itself. That doesn't mean that you don't then reach out to those types of people outside of the church. So weird line. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. It's like the church might discipline itself, but then keep itself enclosed. It'll build up walls
Yeah.
to keep itself safe, because it's unsure of its ability to protect what it believes
Yes.
against the surrounding culture.
Yeah. So it comes down to who has influence on who.
Yeah.
So many Christians have allowed the world to have an influence on them.
Yeah.
Rather than them living the kind of compelling lives that has an influence on their world. That's the whole idea. If you are the salt of the earth, that's the whole idea. You are the light of the world. That's the whole idea of they'll know you're Christians by your love. That Christians, the way that they treat and honor and value each other was to be a compelling influence.
Yeah.
To those standing around watching, going, well, yeah, I want to know something about what they have. First Peter, Second Peter, I think First Peter chapter 3, 15, Paul, Peter writes, always be prepared to give an answer of the hope that's in you.
Yeah.
To anyone who asks. Well, that's only going to work is if you're living the kind of hope that prompts inquiry from the people in your life who don't have that kind of hope. So, yeah, you can make a very clear case from the New Testament that the Christian community was to certainly have influence and accountability over the Christian who wasn't living in obedience.
Mm-hmm.
But that wasn't to ostracize disobedient people from being engaged in the influence of the church.
Yeah. Yeah. Non-Christians. You can't apply the rules of a Christian to somebody who is not a Christian.
Exactly. But I think the point is so many churches have become, we call them the holy huddle. They've become so cloistered in their own little world, their own little relationships, their own little subculture. And they've taken an attitude that we got to stay away from that world that's so bad and evil, that then they don't have a place for having an influence in the lives of non-Christians.
Yeah.
And, that's really on my heart about, Cibolo. We're 29 years old now, and our roots were very much about, a heart for our community and creating places where lost people could feel really comfortable in exploring spiritual journey among us. And yeah, I'm having a bit of a period of evaluation in my life going, 29 years we've been doing it. Have we lost some of that edge? Have we lost some of that, invitation, that openness? And trying to figure out how I, in a sense, move us back toward that or reignite that as, a real heartbeat of our church.
Yeah.
And I think I know how it happened. People would want to probably argue with it, but I do. I feel like in the early days of Cibolo, we had a really passionate, sincere heart about leading our friends to Christ, building relationships, and nurturing those relationships with the hopes of someday introducing them to Christ. And then somewhere along the line, we started hearing so much criticism complain about, well, we need more for us Christians. And that drum just got beat so much that the pendulum swung, pendulum
Swung.
swung. The pendulum went to the other side.
We're professionals, folks.
Yeah, exactly. The pendulum went to the other side of saying, okay, now let's do what we can to provide Christians with resources that they feel like we're investing in their spiritual growth. And I think what happened is that it just swung to that side, and it became such a preoccupation.
Swung too far.
Yeah, so then that heartbeat and that priority and that passion for the lost in our neighborhoods and how we were going to be a church that was really accessible to them, I feel like a little bit of that got compromised.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't to be melodramatic, but I'm looking at like the fourth quarter of my ministry life at Cibolo and wanting to end well and taking some inventory about what will I leave, and feeling a bit of a sense of urgency about getting that pendulum back toward at least a middle, to where, I mean, I think it'd be a great compliment to be a church that was as strong when it comes to evangelism as it is discipleship. Like really have a balance of knowing how those two work hand in hand.
Even hearing them separated just sounds silly.
Sounds silly, yeah. And again, people look at Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. They look at it differently, and go into the world and make disciples. And so make disciples, make disciples, make disciples. That's the command, but everybody wants to make that, this end of the spectrum, investing in Christians to develop them into fully devoted followers of Christ. And I don't think Jesus was being that specific in his understanding of discipleship, because the language of the verse, the surrounding language in the verse, indicates you're supposed to go out into your world. You're not going out into the world that you're finding Christians. Certainly not when he made that construction, because there weren't any.
Yeah.
You're going out into your world to find lost people, to introduce them to the message of the gospel. Go out into the world, and he says, and then baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So there's an inference there that this going out into the world, you've been introduced to non-Christians. You've introduced them to the message of the gospel. They've come to faith in Christ. Now you baptize them as a public identity with that message. And then you teach them to observe all things. Then you start teaching and training and developing them as devoted followers. And I think in the mind of Christ, the whole thing is discipleship.
Yeah.
Discipleship is the going, the sharing the gospel, drawing people to Christ, and helping them to grow. That's discipleship.
Yeah.
But again, my 40 plus years of exposure to it all it really gets pigeonholed into one side of the equation. We try to make evangelism something completely different, and we're not very comfortable over here, so we don't do it very well.
Yeah. Well, very good. Well, any closing thoughts?
I don't think so.
Those were already pretty good closing thoughts. So,
Well, then we'll let those be the closing.
we'll let it ride. All right. Well, thank you, sir.
Well, enjoyed it. Always enjoy having these conversations.
Yes,
with you.
indeed. All right, folks. We'll see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation of Cibolo Creek Community Church. If you did, please consider supporting the ministry of our church. Your donations make a difference. To check out more resources or to share a gift, please visit us at cibolocreek.com. Thanks for listening.